Welcome to Therapeutic Momentum. We take you on an inspiring journey, spanning breakthroughs in science and medicine development. Over the last century, our average life expectancy has increased by more than 20 years. Join us as we go behind the scenes with medical researchers, clinical developers, and other experts working together in the race to tackle life-altering diseases with new treatments and cures.
I'm Karen Akinsanya. I'm a translational scientist working at the intersection between biomedical research and emerging technology. Thanks for tuning in to Therapeutic Momentum. Let's get started. So I'm delighted to be at Northeastern University today, speaking with Sam Scarpino. Really happy that you could join me for this conversation. So perhaps you could start with an introduction to yourself, a little bit of your career history, how you got to Northeastern. We'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I was really thrilled to get the email and excited to chat today. My PhD is in evolutionary biology, ecology, and animal behavior. So you might imagine it's a bit of a winding path from there to my current role, which is Director of AI and Life Sciences in the Institute for Experiential AI and also Professor of Public Health and Health Sciences. My dissertation, I focused on a primarily wet lab study of a gene in a species of fish that causes melanoma. And that involved fieldwork in Mexico, cloning and sequencing the gene, trying to understand something about how it was evolving. As I was doing that, the 2009 H1N1 pandemic happened. And one of the labs that I worked in at the University of Texas at Austin had an NIH grant, and a bunch of individuals on that grant were retasked to work on the public health response. And so I brought some of the nascent modeling tools that I was doing to that work. Afterwards, I got a postdoctoral fellowship at the Santa Fe Institute where I wanted to merge my interest in genetics and infectious diseases with mathematical and computational modeling. From there, I went to the University of Vermont, Northeastern University, then to the Rockefeller Foundation, then back to Northeastern University, and sort of at each step along the way was doing increasingly more computational work, more artificial intelligence, although at the time we were calling it machine learning, and now to my current role at the university where it's very heavily focused on translational AI in the life sciences.
Wonderful. Well, that's quite a journey. Lots of different orthogonal views of life science. So computation has featured more and more as you've been on that journey. Perhaps there was a sort of igniting moment where you realized what was about to happen in the world. Looking back, can you pinpoint what it was that really encouraged you to sort of jump fully into this?
There are a couple of moments. One was during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, where we were receiving data from our collaborators in Mexico City, and maybe most people wouldn't remember back then, but the early data from Mexico, the fatality rate seemed very high for H1N1. People were worried that it was going to be the next big flu pandemic like 1918. And so we were working kind of around the clock trying to understand all the various ways in which those estimates might have been biased. It was the Easter holiday season in Mexico, and so the school social networks were disrupted as a result of the closures in the country. And being at the forefront of kind of rapid response, but in the context of this complex system, which was human society and its response to a pandemic, showed me the power and the necessity of the kinds of computational modeling approaches that we were doing. So that was probably the biggest one. The time that I spent at the Santa Fe Institute, I was there as a summer school student in 2010, learning about physics and nonlinear dynamics from people like Melanie Mitchell, who are now, famous sort of AI scholars and pioneers. That was very, very formative in terms of what I think and what I know about AI. But from the computation perspective, if there was one aha moment, I'd have to point back to 2009 when we were working on the influenza response.
Mm. And you worked at the Rockefeller Foundation, obviously incredible goals of an institution like that. Maybe you can just contrast working in academia, working at a foundation. I know you work a lot with companies. How are these different environments connected?
I've always found myself as an academic working on a lot of translational research, that doesn't mean that we also don't do blue sky research. Most of the blue sky research I've done has been translational problems that we couldn't solve with the tools that were on the shelf. And so we had to go back and try to put some more tools on the shelf. So most of the time when I talk to people about the big differences, they sort of think that it's going to be sort of how translational it is or how fast things are moving. And again, at Northeastern, we work with a lot of startups, we work with a lot of big companies, and we move fast alongside them. I think for me, the biggest difference really is how little difference there is in the quality of the people, in the kinds of impact problems that we're working on, in the opportunity to sort of do good in the world. Although the one thing that I do point out to people is that there are no students, for the most part, outside of universities, and that one of the really special parts about being an academic is working with students and learning from them and seeing them learn and grow and then have long, flourishing careers. And I know we mentor people outside of academia, but that relationship that you have, as an instructor with the students as a mentor is really only something you get inside of the university.
Yeah, sort of evolution in action, watching the next generation, right, as they interact with knowledge, but also, in this case, with technology. You get a very sharp view of that in an academic setting, right?
Absolutely. And in many ways, that sort of puts us on the front lines of what's happening with AI because all of our students are thinking about what is going to happen when they go into the workplace and whether they're picking the right career path and whether they're going to be trained and ready. And we're also sitting inside of the university thinking about, well, how do we ensure that there's still a place for PhD students and master's students and undergraduate students in this age of AI? And sort of what is the role of the student now when you have all of these incredible AI tools? And I think it's more important than ever. But these are really big, complicated questions that we've sort of found ourselves on the cutting edge of in the AI space.
Northeastern's sort of famous, though, for interacting with industry, interacting with the work world. I've become aware of that. My son is applying for colleges. And maybe you can say more about that for people who aren't familiar with the reputation of Northeastern for that integration and immersion with the real world.
Northeastern is famous for our experiential education, our approach to education, and a lot of that is from the co-op program. Although the reason that I sort of said experiential and then stumbled a bit is because we think of it as much broader throughout the way that we do research, lifelong learning than just the co-op program. But almost all of our undergraduates spend half a year to a year working outside of the university as a co-op in industry, in government, in a nonprofit, and that has really led to the experience that these students have changing the way that they learn and preparing them for the world outside of the university in a way that very few other educational programs can prepare someone. And that also provides an opportunity, and the reason we talk about experiential as being more than the co-op is that when our students are there working in the industry, they also bring back things with them into the university. They force me to be a better instructor, but often I get to work with the industry partners as a part of that co-op program. And so I learn more about the hopes and dreams and fears of colleagues in industry, whether it's in R&D or in management or in sales and marketing, operations. And so all of those things create kind of a very strong two-way relationship between the partners that we work with, the researchers inside of the university, together with the students, that really becomes sort of more than the sum of the parts. And that, I think, is why Northeastern has really become world famous for our experiential approach to education, so highly sought after by our students, because that experiential education, that co-op, it's at the undergraduate level, but also at the graduate level. Almost all of our master's students do co-ops. Many of our PhD students will spend a summer or multiple summers working inside of an organization.
Yeah, it's highly impactful, I think, is that real-world immersion. So it does feel as if the world is changing all around us. I think maybe if you went back 50 years, 100 years, there was somebody saying that at any one point in history, because humans have always been incredibly inventive. I was reading the other day that before the printing press, I think less than 10% of the world population could read. And then after the printing press, that number escalated dramatically. Took time. We facing another one of those moments, it feels like, where technology has the ability to help humans evolve in our capabilities and in the next wave of what we're going to be able to do as a race, right? Human race. This co-evolving concept of humans evolving with the technology they create, I think is something you've really stepped right into. Maybe you can talk about AI and life science, but also just more broadly how you're thinking about humans co-evolving with the technology they've created.
It is really hard to appreciate how fast things are moving. I also think about how everybody's probably said their generation experienced the biggest change of any generation. We do have some data points in terms of like the speed of adoption for ChatGPT and really being unprecedented. Although it's interesting to go back and look at what happened after things like the printing press and the computer and the internet, and that's going to be compressed, but the amount of change and the unpredictability is probably going to be just as large in terms of completely remaking not just science, but all of society. Mm. In terms of the coevolution that you were talking about, one of the things that I have come to appreciate over the years and really drives a lot of my own research is the limits of what we can know and predict about living systems. So living systems are complex systems, and by that we mean that they have lots of interacting parts, very hard to predict what's going to happen when all these parts come together. You can't really separate the parts out from each other, so you can't apply reductionist paradigms to study them. If I want to look at, melanoma, I can't think about just the skin. I have to think about many other organs. And in the context of the fish I was studying, it had to do with mating behaviors, how the gene was spreading between the populations. And so you also have to look at the population level in terms of the effects. And you think about any disease that we might be interested in, and there's going to be individual level of effects, environmental effects, population effects, societal effects on what treatments are available. All of those are going to interact to result in this emergent phenomenon, which is the disease. Mm-hmm. And that emergence places limits on how much we can know. And that also means that we have to be able to go out and measure and ask and answer questions in the lab, in our clinical populations, out in the field. And AI is not going to change that. So AI is not going to be able to make predictions about these systems without taking measurements. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the first thing, which is I'm quite confident, and I would be willing to make a very heavy bet that AI cannot replace the wet lab. It may make it faster, it may make it cheaper, it might mean that we can do more with less, but we're never going to get away from the need to ask and answer questions in the lab or in the field. However, that still leaves the question of the humans. So maybe the AI can't replace the wet lab, but can it replace the human scientists? And I think the answer to that is also no, at least with everything that I've seen about current AI technology and where it may be going. Right? So what I think is so exciting about the current AI technology is that it already has the kind of intelligence that we should be impressed and amazed with.
Yeah.
It's just not human-like intelligence. And in fact, I think that's even better because we can do things with our brain that the AI cannot do. The AI can do things that we cannot do. The two of us together, that's a complex system where the whole will be more than the sum of the parts, and there will be emergent things that we can do together with AI that humans cannot do alone and that AI cannot do alone. Now, how you actually do that, that's the challenge. And that's what I think is so exciting, is what we're working on at the Institute for Experiential AI, is how you design these human AI systems that are ethical and responsible, that take advantage of what the AI can do and what we can do, integrate them in with the wet lab. What questions should we be asking and answering that are most beneficial to this human AI, coevolution? For me, that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. I think it's going to change the world for the better. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that there aren't strong forces pushing us in the other direction towards removing humans, increased automation, you could remove the wet lab from the loop. It's just that you're not going to end up in a place where we're leading healthier, happier lives.
Right. I had a recent conversation with a former colleague of mine, Robert Plenge, and I thought he put it very well, which is when we know what truth is, we can train a machine learning model to examine truth in that domain, right? We talked about the printing press. We as a human race have written a lot of words and access to that training set has led to the LLMs. I'm very impressed with the ability for an algorithm to write as well as it does. In that field, we have so much data that we can train a model and let that model, guided by humans, to your point, generate productivity for us. But in other areas, and you point to biology as a general category, but then let's get into the area that I spend a lot of my time is pathophysiology and our ability to understand pathophysiology in a way that we can intercede. We don't know, as Robert put it, we don't know what truth is. We haven't measured this at any significant scale. And so it's really hard to train a model around something that you actually don't know the bounds of. But I think you're correct that this technology will help us do more measurement. But that measurement has to be guided by the questions that we ask, correct?
I agree. My hypothesis, I think there's a lot of evidence to support this, is that we can never have the kind of truth in biological systems that you have in written language that will allow these models to perform the way that they can perform with text. And that's setting aside the hallucinations that are baked into the math and all the other issues with the current AI tools. But the thing with living systems is that if you poke and prod them, they're going to respond. And they're almost certainly going to respond in ways that are very difficult or impossible to predict. One of the things that really sticks in my mind, studies of cystic fibrosis models in mice. We know the mutation that will cause cystic fibrosis-like symptoms in a mouse. You engineer that into the mouse embryo, and deterministically, the mouse will have a cystic fibrosis-like phenotype. If you then go in and you use something like CRISPR or some other technology to try and move the phenotype towards a non-cystic fibrosis phenotype, we can get 80% of the way there in studies that I've read. Now, obviously for a human with cystic fibrosis, that would be life-changing. Mm-hmm. But it's 100% causal in one direction, and only 80% can we figure it out in the other direction. And that's for one of the simplest genetically determined conditions that we study. Mm. And so for me, I think it's asking the right question, but also being able to ask lots of questions. Some of them will be right, some of them will be wrong, in many different environmental contexts, in many different genome backgrounds, in many different developmental settings, all of which are going to impact how we might intervene on a particular condition or how we think about, pathophysiology. And that's not something that AI can solve for us, because these systems, they only ever make small amounts of data, right? Like there's only a little bit of data that comes from Sam Scarpino and his family and the people that I interact with in my social network. And the further you get away from me, the less relevant any of those data are going to be for making a prediction about my health outcomes. Mm-hmm. And there's just no more data that you can go gather, right? And that is always going to be a limit in living systems. And I actually think it makes it more exciting, because that means there's new kinds of AI algorithms we can be developing. There's new kinds of collaborations between wet lab and dry lab. There's a bright, wonderful future where humans and AI are working together to solve the world's biggest problems that we know are probably beyond the reach of our own brains, and probably also know are beyond the reach of artificial intelligence. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, that scale issue, I think it's pretty clear that one of the limitations humans have is that we cannot digest, analyze very large data sets. We know how to design the collection of that data set, but we don't have that capacity. I think that's one of the areas of enormous potential for collaboration, particularly in the life sciences, where if we're able to leverage AI to design maybe even grander experiments than we might have in the past, we're already talking about multimodal data. And you mentioned the word reductionist earlier. Because of the complexity, we have reduced a lot of our inquiry down to very sort of simple systems. It does appear that perhaps now with this ability to look not just at one layer of data, but how these interact in a multimodal fashion, that we can ask harder questions. Do you agree with that?
I do agree that AI is going to help us ask harder questions. And I think for both of the reasons that you said, and then probably reasons that neither one of us could even dream up yet. But we know that neural networks are really good at modeling nonlinear relationships between layers of data. And one very reductionist way to think about a phenotype is that it is the outcome of a lot of nonlinear relationships between layers of data, the genome, the transcriptome, the metabolome, the proteome, the environment. And so if we collect enough of the right kinds of data, I think we can build models that will be predictive in certain settings, and at a minimum will tell us what questions we should be asking and answering. What are the interesting questions that we don't have answers to yet versus the questions that we just didn't know they were answered, but it's sitting in the data somewhere. One of the examples that I give is, we were studying a developmental disorder in mice, and we have a prediction about what pathway is likely implicated. Now, we could try to raise funding and get the knockout or knockdown mice, do validation in the lab. That would be very expensive. That would be costly in terms of the lives of the mice. I suspect that sitting on someone's computer somewhere is the experiment that we would want to run already finished. And what if we could just query that and get a pretty good sense of whether or not it would be worth it to test the mice and go to the next level of expense? And I think you could imagine how that would translate into not just our scientific work, but the work that comes after the science in terms of the entire process of drug discovery and development, of bringing new treatments and interventions, new biomarkers. The more that we can do to be confident in our assessments before we move on to the next phase of discovery and trial and invention, the lower the failure rates are going to be. That means that we're going to be able to look at increasingly rare diseases, increasingly specialized treatments, bringing down the costs of medications. And so that, for me, that's the bright future ahead of us, is what that can mean.
Yeah.
And certainly the ability to screen large amounts of data is going to be essential. And that's something that we're doing every day. Probably everyone that's in science right now is using AI tools to screen the literature. One of the quotes that I would give, I'm going to get the number wrong, it's been a while, but I think it was every 3 minutes for 2 years during the pandemic, there was a paper published with SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 in the title. And there's just no way anybody could keep up with that. And then the one that I put on top of that is, I think it was every 15 minutes for CRISPR during that time frame. So yes, the COVID pandemic was a little bit unprecedented, but it's not like other things that we're studying aren't happening at such a fast pace that there's just no possible way that even large teams of humans could keep up with it.
Indeed, indeed. So you've described living systems as fundamentally about networks and aggregation events. Can you enlighten us what you mean by that?
Well, one of the ways that I've thought about the history of life, and this is not uniquely my idea, is that you have single cell organisms, and then you have multicellular or eukaryotes that are single cell, but it's multiple organisms that have come together. You have multicellular eukaryotes. You have eukaryotes that interact together socially. You have the kinds of social structure that emerges in humans. And one of the ways that we might conceptualize that is where each entity is the node in the network, and you draw an edge between them if they're connected. And so that could be bacteria that are together in a biofilm or that are cross-feeding off of each other. That could be the organelles that are a part of a single cell eukaryote. That could be the eukaryotic cells. It could be then cellular, differentiation within tissues. So you have the heart cells connected together, that are then more loosely connected to the kidney and liver cells in the same way that you might have a looser connection between two bacteria that are cross-feeding off of each other than two bacteria that are part of a biofilm. And then you go up into thinking about not up in terms of necessarily up being better, but in terms of having more and more cells, more and more differentiation between individuals. So the two of you and I are connected now via a social network. And so one of the ways, and this is what we do at the Network Science Institute at Northeastern University, where I'm also a faculty member, is to study the world as this collection of networks and this complicated interdependency that arises where you have multiple ways in which we're connected to each other. The cells in our body are connected to other cells. We're connected to the bacteria cells that are on our skin and in our body in ways. And so we can conceptualize all of that as this series of networks that both exists now and goes back into the past. And this is one of the reasons that I talk about generating small data from living systems and the challenge of AI is maybe you see all of that causal ambiguity and causal dependence that exists as a result of this complex network structure that's not just our bodies and our social network, but also our developmental trajectories going backwards in time, the evolutionary trajectories going backwards in time, and all of that context dependence that's carried along with those networks.
I see. And so this comes back almost to this idea of interdependence between us and the AI systems that we're building. In the preamble before we started, you were talking about the types of people who are perhaps being sought after in AI R&D. Perhaps you can talk a little about that, and it sort of touches on the co-evolution theme, but also just this connectedness between us and these systems.
Absolutely. And it also, shows the oversimplification I made when I said that, AI could model the interdependence between these various layers. I'm sure there were people rolling their eyes thinking, well, but you can't really think of the genome as a layer and the transcriptome as a layer and the proteome as a layer. Those are densely interconnected layers that are often hard to distinguish from each other in terms of where one stops and another one starts. And that's part of what we try to understand mathematically is how can we really quantify where Sam Scarpino stops and where the environment around him starts. It's going to be some kind of gradient. At some point, it'll probably be more different from me than not, but it may be very sharp. It may be very long. It probably depends on the temperature outside and where the wind is blowing and a whole variety of other things. And the same is going to be true for AI systems, right? So the way in which we integrate these AI into our social network is going to matter. Mm-hmm. And not just in terms of the network structure, so like how many AIs connected to how many humans, but what kinds of AI connected to what kinds of people working on what kinds of tasks. And it still seems to be the case, and I don't see any evidence to suggest that this is going to change soon, that AI doesn't have the kinds of creative leaps, creative combinations of things that would not necessarily seem to go together that our brains have. I think one of the things that remains special about human brains is how we can make conceptual leaps into areas that we've seen no data on and often be right about what's going on. And I think that's because we've evolved to have brains like that, right? So you imagine if we live in this world that's hard to predict because it's a complex adaptive living system, then our brains probably evolved to be as effective as possible in that environment. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise that our brains add a lot of value when it comes to working on kinds of these sort of creative problems that AI will struggle with, because that's not how the AI was trained, right? It was trained to work on a very different set of problems than our brain was trained in. And for me, that presents an opportunity. How do we provide value to students? How do we ensure that there are still humans in the loop? And that, yes, one is ethical and responsible AI. We want to make sure that the AI is doing things that we find valuable and ethically appropriate and responsible. And by definition, that means we have to be involved in the process. But if we nurture and train people in the creative, skeptical way of thinking that brings in many different lines of evidence and can make those exciting leaps, then we will be ensuring that humans remain robustly important in this AI future.
So talking of students, where do you see perhaps jobs that may no longer exist because of AI? And where do you see the potential for whole new jobs? I mean, again, I was thinking about the monks sitting for 3 years to write one book, and we've come a long way since then. We're dealing with words in a wholly different way right now. All of these different innovations, yes, some jobs were destroyed, but many were created. How do you see that playing out in the near future?
The honest answer is I don't know. I can tell you some things we're seeing right now. We also look back at history. I mean, again, what's happening now is unprecedented in some ways, but not unprecedented in others. So it was just basically one generation before me and PhD students where, sequencing a single gene would have been a science or nature paper and basically your whole dissertation.
Yeah.
I cloned and sequenced 26 genes from 26 different species, and that was one paper and one chapter of my dissertation. And now if you did that, people wouldn't even blink an eye at it. So we've always had to evolve and adapt as humans in terms of the jobs that are available, the training, et cetera. So in one ways, it's happening really fast, and some of our institutions are not great at moving quick enough to respond. It's one of the reasons why I think being at Northeastern is so exciting, is because the students are out there learning on the job, and the jobs are moving really fast.
Yeah.
We're moving really fast inside of the classrooms, of course, too. But the students are really out on the cutting edge of what's happening. I think, we heard about a tech hiring slowdown. I remain skeptical that that's really about AI versus other macroeconomic trends and headwinds and coming out of the pandemic and a variety of other things. What we are seeing for sure is a lot of opportunity for students who are bilingual in AI and aspects of the life sciences like bioinformatics and pharmacology, where we have had to come up with entirely new training programs because that wasn't typically a part of the trajectory.
Yeah.
And so I remain a little bit skeptical about where things are going to go by the wayside. I'm sure there will be jobs and career paths that close, or jobs and career paths that were previously very lucrative, pathways into the upper middle class that are no longer going to be as lucrative. But I am quite confident, at least in terms of what's opening up in the near term. And that's really, I'm not just saying this because I work in the space, but I'm saying this because I see it every day with our students, where they're getting higher paying jobs than I have right out of their master's degree, which is amazing and wonderful and what we're training them for. It's really at that intersection of AI and the life sciences. And I feel quite confident that given the continued need for wet labs in the loop, for human brains, for the kinds of experimentation that are, for all practical purposes, mathematical facts about living systems, that will always be a robust career path. Mm-hmm. But it is forcing almost everyone to rethink how we teach, to rethink how we select people for jobs, to think how we train and mentor them inside of jobs. And in some ways, that's a really great opportunity for us. I recently wrote a piece with the director of the writing program at Northeastern, Professor Lori Nardoni, asking how much has really changed? And in some ways, everything, and in other ways, nothing, because we've always wanted the process to be more important than the products. Mm-hmm. And you teach the process, and that's robot proof, as President Ayoun, president of Northeastern University, would say. And it's the same kind of thing we're seeing in terms of industry. When you look at what sort of exams students are being given for technical, qualifications into a tech company, it's about the process. It's about the creative part of the brain. It's about those elements that we're still teaching students in. So I think it's too soon to say what's going to happen. I'm sure it's going to be chaotic, and I'm sure that there will be jobs that aren't the jobs they used to be. but I'm seeing just as many new exciting career paths opening up. And I remain really excited about the life sciences and AI right at that intersection.
Yeah, and I think our thirst for data is only going to increase. And I think that in of itself is going to, it doesn't matter what domain you're in, actually. I think if we have created a tool that essentially consumes data, there's going to be a scarcity of data that I think is going to occupy our minds, jobs, businesses for quite a bit of time to come. And so data, I think, will be important to many, many jobs in a way. And as you were saying, there used to be the silo of the bioinformatician and then the biologist and the chemist and so on being all separate fields of study. But now we're seeing that merger. And I think it's partly because data is important everywhere. And that's exciting. So I think the pivot now is perhaps to a look at the future, not just from a jobs perspective, but the opportunities for the human race here. You've touched on some of this as you've been speaking. What are you excited about when you look towards the future and some of the grand challenges that we are going to be able to solve?
I completely agree on the data piece. I am not dodging your question about the grand challenges, but one of the things that came up in a conversation with some computer scientists, because part of this is sort of how do you get the computer scientists excited about life sciences? Life sciences is hard and messy, and there's a lot of things that you have to memorize and a lot of acronyms and all sorts of stuff that come with being in the life sciences. And one of the reasons is that the amount of data is unimaginable and growing at unimaginable rates.
Yeah.
And if I'm right about the fact that we're never going to be able to collect enough data to train an AI that can remove the need to collect more data, then we're only ever going to be collecting more and more and more and more data, which means our algorithms are going to break. It means that we're going to have to worry about how these networks scale. It's going to mean that we're going to have to worry about efficiency when it comes to using electricity and water and all sorts of other things. And so I see a really big opportunity in this space of big life sciences data and the opportunities for major breakthroughs on the algorithmic side, on the neural network architecture side, on thinking of entirely new ways of computing, neuromorphic computing, and the kinds of things that are sort of out on the edge of what we're imagining being necessary because of the life sciences, right? You probably don't need that for text data.
Interesting.
But you do need it for biological data.
What is neuromorphic? Maybe you can help everybody understand that.
Well, so I'm not the right person to talk about it either, but it's this idea about how you build AI systems that would have more of sort of the network qualities that look like our brain as opposed to the way in which you would have a sort of standard neural network architecture, which sounds like it would look like our brain because of the word neural, but doesn't actually look anything like our brain at all. In terms of the future, near term, I'm excited about what AI can bring to leading healthier lives where we spend more time thinking about prevention and wellness than we think about response and late stage intervention.
Yeah.
It's easier said than done, often because we know what we need to do differently in our lives. We just don't do it.
Yes.
But these AI technologies are very good at behavioral intervention and helping bring the latest science to bear on how we can lead healthier lives. I think there are also ways in which the practice of clinical medicine will evolve very rapidly, and we're already seeing it, right? That physicians are spending more time with patients because of ambient listening devices that are doing note-taking, and that's going to change the doctor-patient interaction. And it's also going to mean that the physician brains get to spend time doing the things that they're going to be better at doing than some of the AI diagnostic tools are going to be better at doing. In addition, I do think there's an opportunity for more equitable access to care. We work with a genomic tumor board out of the Jackson Lab, a Maine Cancer Genomics Initiative that's focused on rural oncologists and genomic medicine, right? So the pace of medical advances when it comes to how you would use genomic data from a solid state tumor to recommend treatments is moving so rapidly that most oncologists can't keep up with it. And so then you think in a rural area where you already have fewer oncologists. And so having the right oncologist in the right rural area to provide the treatment just can't happen.
Right.
But we can use artificial intelligence to bring the knowledge of oncologists out into the rural areas and bring that treatment out into the rural areas. So one of the things that I'm really excited about and really optimistic about is how AI is going to change our approach to health and wellness, and how it's also going to impact the quality and the reach of clinical medicine. I think we also have the opportunity with artificial intelligence to approach grand challenges ranging from things like pandemic prevention to climate change. Pandemic prevention in an area where I personally work. How do you pick out, it's harder than a needle in a haystack problem. How do you pick out the microbe on top of the needle in the haystack that might cause the next pandemic? How do you develop a rapid response monoclonal antibody platform that can deliver monoclonal antibodies for a new pandemic threat, at least in the clinical trial within weeks instead of months? Rapidly adaptable vaccine platforms. How do we think about, we have funding from the Rockefeller Foundation to think about how we could be better repurposing drugs to fight antimicrobial resistance, or finding drugs that may have failed for one purpose but were safe in another way and could be repurposed for antimicrobial resistance, bringing to bear improved toxicity predictions, improved delivery predictions that might, again, decrease the failure rates and then change the landscape of what's possible in the pharmaceutical space. So for me, I think the biggest, most exciting opportunities are going to be in how we approach health and wellness from many, many different angles, from the public health angle, from the medical perspective, from the informational perspective, all of these things being integrated with AI. I do see major challenges, which is just because we feel very confident and have a lot of evidence to suggest that humans are important and humans can add huge amounts of value to AI. Just because we know that the AI can't function without being able to ask and answer questions in the lab, in the clinical population, doesn't mean that market forces won't push us into a setting where we don't have humans in the loop, where the AI is writing most of the code and designing most of the drugs and making decisions about what candidates to advance or not. And where the AI is being utilized highly effectively by a small subset of individuals, and most of the rest of the world is not benefiting from that artificial intelligence. And so instead of the vision and the dream of improved cancer care in rural areas, we have ever improving cancer care in Boston and not in Western Massachusetts or in Northern Maine or in Central Florida, much less in other parts of the world as well. And so that, I think, is the conversation that we need to be having from the perspective of how we're using AI systems, how we're thinking about AI regulation, how we're thinking about where we should be making public sector investments in data and in artificial intelligence and in training. And if we do that now, if we're thoughtful about it now, we can have this future that I think many people believe is not right around the corner, but is really almost here. But that also means that we have almost no time to put the systems in place that we need in order to achieve that in a way that increases the health and wellness across our global population, not in small subsets of the global population. That is actually one of the reasons why I get frustrated with the debate about AGI and superhuman intelligence. I don't think we should be sitting around waiting. One, there's no real way to know, right? Like, you can't get anyone pinned down to agree that if the AI does this, it's superhuman. I think if you'd put a bunch of the current AI results on the table in front of people 10 years ago, they would say that it's AGI already.
Yeah.
And instead, I think we're spending a lot of time wondering whether AI is going to wipe us all off the planet or lead to some new superbug or some catastrophic situation. And we're not focused on the fact that we need to be building these responsible, fit for purpose, ethical AI tools today for today's challenges, ensuring broad societal benefit sharing, that if there are jobs that go away, we have funding for retraining and upskilling individuals, that we're prepared for economic disruptions, not in 10 years or 5 years, but in 5 months or 10 months. That, I think, is the real challenge that we need to be focused on.
That's absolutely right. But I also think that at the end of the day, there's always a gap between early adopters, people who have more access, and those that don't. If you go back to even when electricity became available, it took a long time. I think it was 40 to 60 years to get everybody access to electricity. So I do think that's a recurring pattern, that there will always be this gap. But one hopes that high tide rises all boats. So to your point, I was in India. Talk about the Rockefeller Foundation. I worked with Naveen Rao. I was part of the Merck for Mothers Foundation, and we went to India. And it was interesting because telemedicine had almost leapfrogged the West, because people in very rural areas with access to a telephone were able to contact a physician in Delhi and get advice. That was very inspiring, because without the infrastructure in certain parts of the world, the arrival of technology had allowed them to kind of leapfrog and have this amazing network of access to very advanced medicine in rural areas. And I'd like to think that just the fact that we have these advances will benefit everyone, even if there is a gap.
I agree. When you mentioned that you worked at Merck, while we were chatting, I was going to ask if you knew Naveen.
Yes, I do.
And I was thinking it's a big company. It's no way that she knows the person. So I worked for Naveen when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation. So I was on the health team. I have a very inspiring person, and also had an amazing career at Merck.
Yes.
As well. I'm of two minds about it. So I realized that if you just sort of take the last answer that I gave, it sounds a bit like I'm not excited about what capitalism can provide and entrepreneurship and rapid growth. And I absolutely am. Mm-hmm. I think that we have produced amazing, world-changing discoveries across industries, and that so much of that has been driven by the market forces and the opportunity for entrepreneurs to invent, but also do incredibly well for themselves and raise huge amounts of capital to support their dreams and visions. And that capital comes with risks. And again, that needs to be rewarded. And oftentimes, as a result of that, we end up with things that we never, I think, probably could have ended up with before. And one of the consequences of that is that there are going to be gaps. And there'll be gaps for two reasons. One, because anytime you're moving fast, not everybody's going to be moving fast, right? So that's one kind of gap. And that is the kind of gap that will close itself, I think, naturally without a lot of intervention. I think there's a second kind of gap where you have a huge amount of access difference that arises. Mm-hmm. And you often have incentives that are not aligned between public and private sector. And for me, that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity for philanthropic foundations, for governments, for others to think about how do we close some of those gaps, right? And so are there things we could be doing not to slow down the pace of innovation, not to prevent the rewards that are due from the huge amount of risk that goes into, the early stage ventures and the high failure rates of pharmaceuticals, but instead to say, okay, well, we have some of these gaps, and we need to figure out, are there ways in which we could be ameliorating? And, one example in the United States with, ARPA-H and the federal government and investing in rural healthcare and really trying to point entrepreneurs and point researchers inside of academia and build new sorts of public-private collaborations around these areas where previously there might not have been as much investment. That's sort of the thing that I'm envisioning, or the work of the Rockefeller Foundation to say, can we leverage philanthropic dollars to help with the technology transfer into these into these underserved areas? Or can we leverage the philanthropic dollars to show early stage proof of concept in a way that de-risks things, and then other sorts of incentive structures can flow in? And so I didn't want to sound like I was being down on capitalism. Instead, I'm thinking, is there a way that we could be broader in our approach to artificial intelligence that acknowledges there are going to be strengths and weaknesses of all the different mechanisms that one might use to advance the technology? And if we are thoughtful about that, could we be investing a little bit more over here to ensure that the benefits are flowing to individuals in the rural areas and not just the urban areas? Or as genomic medicine advances, that we don't leave behind populations of people in the rest of the world that would benefit just as much or more from what we're inventing in the US.
I'm with you. And if anything, I actually feel that in some ways one hopes that the technology almost democratizes access to innovation and the ability for global innovators, no matter where they reside, to participate in and to accelerate the human race's advancement, whether it's health, whether it's solving for climate change, and meeting people where they are, where the problems are. I think we have to be intentional about making sure that that technology is in the hands of the people who care most about the problem. I feel strongly about this in our ability to help people with rare diseases. Hopefully, this technology advance will have our industry not just focus on the big chronic diseases, because those are the ones that have the largest populations, but it will enable us, by collecting more data, by learning more about disease, by putting the tools in the hands of more people, including foundations and family foundations who care immensely about certain diseases, that this is sort of democratizing the innovation as opposed to having it held by very few institutions. So I'm very much on board with that. But one of the challenges, and we'll wrap up soon, I think it's getting dark. This is such a great conversation. One of the questions, though, is in order to make that possible, compute has to be available to more people and more regions of the world, correct?
Right. So I really like the vision that you painted. And, in the context of rare diseases, there are at least three things that feel very empowering about AI. One is just the ability to network people together and discover relationships between individuals in terms of the diseases that they might be faced with that they didn't know were out there. And that can just be very inspiring as an individual, but also means that there are more people out there who can work together to solve the problem. The second is, as we talked about earlier, that if we can bring the costs down and the failure rates down, that means that increasingly rare diseases become economically viable for more and more companies, more and more innovators. And that means that there's just going to be more and more effort and more opportunity out there to work on increasingly rare diseases. And one of the things that we've all come to appreciate over the last 20 years is, almost every disease is a rare disease, especially if we're thinking about cancer or something like that. And so it might be that you don't think of yourself as having a rare disease, but you get, a cancer diagnosis, and that treatment's going to become increasingly precise as we move through it already is, but as we move through the next few years. And then the final piece is around the data. And one of the things that I used to talk about quite a lot was in the context of ethical and responsible data, is that most people think of that right away as not using the data, carefully locking it away.
Yeah.
Many individuals want the data to be used because they're interested in a cure or a treatment or a biomarker. There's a woman in the UK that's suing her GP because the GP isn't releasing the records to the biobank. And she wants the records in the UK biobank so that they can be used to develop new treatments and develop new understandings of disease. And so in the context of the rare diseases, it helps find and bring together more people that may want to be sharing data on their lived experience and on their genome and transcriptome and proteome to help inform. The challenge, though, as you pointed out, is the compute. It's the compute, it's also the data centers, right? So plenty of countries like India and Kenya, have GDPR type laws that require data on health of individuals to be stored and computed on in sovereign soil. And in India, that's manageable now because there are more and more data centers in India. In Kenya, it's still a very different story. And many, many other countries are creating these kinds of GDPR type laws. So you have the data center problem. You also have the access to the compute and whether you can run the models locally on your own data to be in compliance with sovereign data laws, whether you can afford access to the APIs, whether you have the necessary bandwidth and internet connection. And that's an area where I think there's a lot of opportunity for investment to both bring data centers, bring compute, bring high bandwidth connection into more and more parts of the globe, but also look at how do we innovate to make the models smaller, bring them more and more onto edge devices, onto smaller and smaller GPUs, and still function. And this is one of those sort of grand challenges now, I think, in artificial intelligence is how do we make the models smaller, more efficient, use less energy, use less GPUs, require less water for cooling. And that's also going to democratize the access because the smaller the models are, the less barrier there's going to be to having them in the hands of people all over the world to work on the problems in their areas, the diseases that are affecting them in their communities, the small communities of rare disease individuals all over the world who then become, one community together to work, towards a cure or treatment.
Well, I think we're going to have to do a part 2. This is so interesting.
I've really enjoyed the conversation. Yeah, it's been fun.
Well, thank you for taking the time. Really fascinating. I think people are really going to enjoy this. So thanks again.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
All right. Take care.